The following is a presentation of Hobson Media. Woohoo!
It was just a few weeks ago that here on The Big Impact, we featured the incredible story of Michael Franzese, the Colombo crime family's top leader, before turning his life around and embracing faith. Today, you'll meet his wife.
And then it just hit me, and I just said, how does he know that? How does he know that there could possibly be somebody on the other side of the door? And then it just said, wow, was he at some point in his life, was he the person that was on the other side of the door at some point?
What's it like to be married to a member of the mob? Cammy Franzese is our featured guest on The Big Impact.
This is The Big Impact, featuring conversations with inspiring, motivational, creative, innovative, and just plain interesting people from all walks of life. Here's Bill Hobson.
Hello and welcome into The Big Impact. I'm Bill Hobson, and I sure am glad to have you along listening today as we bring you an incredibly powerful story featuring Cammy Franzese. She is the wife of Michael Franzese. His life story was part of the plot line and the key character line from the movie Goodfellas, because Michael was the man in charge of the Colombo crime family, one of America's most notorious mob families. And his story, which we told a few weeks ago here on The Big Impact, I highly recommend you go back and listen to it if you have the opportunity. His story is incredible. To go from being the Mafia kingpin to a man in solitary confinement who found his faith in Christ and walked away from the mob. It's an amazing story, and I never really thought we'd come anywhere close to topping it until today. Because when you hear from the lady who stayed by his side through all of it, all of the ups and downs, all of the frightening moments, all of the incarceration visits, the raising of children, the managing of a household, and coming to grips with the reality that she married someone she didn't know was in the mob. Put yourself in her shoes and imagine having that surprise revealed to you after you've already been to the altar. And I think you can understand why the story of Cammy Franzese is such a powerful one. And we'll get to it here in just a moment. First, I just want to real quickly invite you to support the program. I'm not going to talk about it for long. I just want to make sure you know that The Big Impact is alive and continuing because of your generosity. And so if you would like to support us on a monthly basis or just make a one-time gift of $5 or whatever it is, we would love to have you do that. All of the options are explained in the notes to the podcast you're listening to now. And for those of you who are listening on the radio, just go directly to bigimpactradio.com and you'll see the links right there on the home page. We won't spend a lot of time talking about it today, but I want you to know how much we appreciate those who stand along with us as we inject positive, inspiring, and uplifting content into a culture that sorely needs it. All right, let's get moving into our conversation with Cammy Franzese. It was just a few weeks ago when I brought to this program the testimony, the real life story of Michael Franzese, former mob boss in the Colombo crime family, and it was one of the most listened to episodes we've ever had on this program. And I was deeply moved by the change in his life to accept the things of faith and walk away from great riches and a criminal path, to say the very least. When your life story is included in the movie Goodfellas, you know it's not for good reasons. And so you may remember, those of you who listened, that part of Michael's testimony included the incredible role that his wife played in introducing him to faith. And it's just awesome to be able now to talk with what I sort of part kiddingly referred to as Michael's much better half, Cammy Franzese. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Doing all right.
What a story. Right. Have you any guess as to how many times between you and Michael you have shared your testimony to audiences around the world?
I mean, for myself, obviously not as many as Michael because he's constantly on the road and I was home with, the family. But I would say maybe hundreds. Michael's in the thousands.
Yeah.
I would say I've done it maybe a couple hundred times.
Every once in a while, when I'm out and about speaking, and if my wife is with me, quite often people will ask about the story of the two of us first meeting, because I think that's a common point of curiosity among people. They want to know how you came together. Do you still remember?
Do I still remember?
Yeah, the first time that you met Michael Franzese.
Yeah, I actually do. I was a dancer in Florida, one of the dancers in the movie, and we were all the dancers. We had a day off, and we were sitting around the pool and swimming, and everybody just kind of hanging out, having a good day. And he came with a few friends of his, and they sat at one of the tables. And I just got out of the pool, and I was just kind of hanging out. And he went to his car and came back with a box of leg warmers and T-shirts and stuff that had the logo of the film on it. And his assistant was handing them out to everybody. And by the time she got to me, she didn't really have anything left. So I don't know. I sometimes wondered if that was intentional or not, since everybody else seemed to get a little something. So Mike kind of noticed this. So I got up and I saw him get up and walk away. So I kind of sat to myself, and about 10 minutes later, he came back and handed me a box full of T-shirts and leg warmers. And he said, I kind of noticed you didn't get anything, and I wanted to make sure that you did. So this is for you. And he said, I'm, Michael, the producer of the film. He's like, I know your name is Cammie Garcia. And I said, yes, that's me. And that was our very first conversation.
Now, just to make sure everybody's understanding the context, which film are you referring to?
It was called Knights of the City. It was a dance film, kind of like a West Side Story, Romeo and Juliet, in modern day. It took place in Miami, Florida, and that's where we met.
And at that time, what did you know of him aside from being a producer on that movie project?
Nothing. I knew nothing about him. That was my first encounter with him. That's the first time I knew that he was also the producer. He said, I'm the producer of the movie. So I said, okay, that sounds great. And thank you very much. And he left me with my stuff and talked with me for a little bit, just asking me, are you enjoying the film and this and that? And that was that. So I knew nothing about him.
And little did you know what was to come. So the relationship began there. How did it progress to the point where you thought to yourself, you know what, I kind of think I like to hang out with this guy maybe for the rest of my life?
Oh, gosh. Well, we saw each other, off and on throughout. We were all staying at the same hotel, obviously. So everybody was bumping into everybody all the time. And I saw him around, but I guess it was a couple of days later, I was in the office and I was mailing two letters. I was mailing one letter to my mom and dad, who lived in Anaheim, and then I was mailing another letter to my boyfriend. And as I was putting my letters into the mailbox there, he was standing behind me, and I heard his voice. He goes, you don't really want to mail those, do you? And I turned around and I said, of course I do. That's why I'm here. And he's like, well, who are they to? And I'm like, well, one for my parents and one's for my boyfriend. He's like, well, I just mail the one to your parents and forget about the other one.
Okay, but Cammie, with the knowledge that you didn't really have at the time of the background of Michael's family, there are certain ways one can make that statement sound a little more imposing than others, right?
That is true. That is very, very true. But I just remember there was this really beautiful girl that he was in the lobby with. She was tall and had long dark hair, just a really beautiful Italian woman. Actually, I shouldn't say girl, woman. And I just assumed that was either, his wife, his girlfriend, somebody, because he was standing next to her. And I said to him, shouldn't you be over there with whoever that beautiful woman is over there? He goes, oh, no. He's like, that is one of my dear friends. That's his girlfriend. She just flew in today because she has a bit part in the film. He's like, you don't think that I would be over here talking to you if that were my wife or my girlfriend? And I was just like, I'm not really sure what you would be doing. So that was our second encounter. I proceeded on to mail my both of my letters. I dropped them both in, smiled, and just walked away. And he kind of just looked at me like, okay, I see this one here, So we had a few encounters like that, I mean, it was a couple weeks. And then one night, we were having a production meeting with everybody. And this was the movie set. There was just dancers and actors, and everybody was having a good time. And it was my first time that I was ever away from home. So I was just a little homesick. Although I was having a good time doing the film, I was homesick, and there was just lots of stuff going on, just rumors with this dancer and that dancer, and somehow my name had got in there about me and Michael. And I guess that must have stemmed from him giving me all that stuff when we met for the first time. Everybody kind of saw him walk up to me, so everybody started to talk about, oh well, they must be up to no good together or whatever. And I just was really upset by it because it wasn't true. That was the first time I met him. I didn't really know him. And so I was just kind of bummed, and I was standing outside, and he said, what's wrong with you? You look really sad. And I said, well, I am sad. I'm just upset. I'm like, these are the rumors, and they're not true. And I don't really know you. We haven't had that many conversations. And then we just started talking then. He's like, well, tell me what's going on. Who's saying this, all this stuff? And I said, I've never been away from home. This is the first time. I'm feeling, I'm really close to my mom. There's a lot of things going on the set that I don't know if my mom, would be happy with. And I don't know, thinking back now, I mean, I was 20 years old. I probably sounded like very silly and naive at the time. I kept saying my mom would not like this. My parents would not like that. But meanwhile, I'm, 3,000 miles away from home doing a film. So he was just really sweet and kind. And he said, well, do I need to fire somebody? What do I need to do to make everybody, I don't want you to go home. I want you to stay here. And that was that. And, he said, let's get together and maybe have a drink. And I was like, well, I don't really drink. And he said, well, maybe we can have some milk and coffee. And I'm like, milk and cookies. And I said, well, that's, kind of sarcastic. But, I said, I'll think about it. And then we just started talking about, that's just kind of how our conversation started, just little bits and pieces throughout the couple of weeks, just leading up to actually finally having an actual date.
So he was persistent, and you were a little feisty at the time.
I was.
Right? You held your ground.
I did. I mean, he was very persistent, and I think I held my ground, in all honesty, was because I just wasn't interested.
Yeah.
I just thought he was, a nice gentleman. He was being very kind to me and trying to make me feel better, because I was considering just kind of going home when I was done filming and not staying around for the after party and all that stuff. But he was kind of talking me into saying, I don't want you to go home. I want you to stay. And I just thought that was kind of sweet. But never did it even cross my mind that there would be anything other than that, because I just was not interested. At the time, I had a boyfriend, and I just, he was 13 years older than me. And I just thought he's nice, but he's old, which is funny. I think about now, like, 31, 32 is so old.
Well, now later on, you would learn the full scope of Michael's life story. But at that time, where was he in relationship to his Mafia work?
Well, when I heard the word Mafia, being thrown around New York and Florida, but I didn't really know, what that meant. I really didn't. I mean, I'm from Anaheim, California. That meant nothing to me. That meant, the Godfather movie that maybe I saw a few minutes of, but never really paid attention to. So when I really found out about Michael's life was, sounds kind of crazy, was years later. I mean, I knew there was something going on, that his life was pretty colorful. I knew that he had a lot of business deals. But I did kind of relate all of those things that I heard. I really related them to Michael's father, Sonny, because I did know about his father. Everybody on the set knew about his father, and they were talking about Michael's father, but they didn't really say much about Michael other than he was the movie producer, and he did this, and he did that. And so I just automatically assumed that it was all about Sonny and not Michael. So,
well, let me take a break on the program, and we'll come back. We'll pick up the conversation from there. Our guest is Cammy Franzese, and her book is called This Thing of Ours, How Faith Saved My Mafia Marriage. We're back with more of that conversation in a moment.
This edition of The Big Impact with Bill Hobson will continue after this brief break.
At the encouragement of some of our listeners, I'm going to spend less time asking for your support and more time praying that it will come in as we continue injecting positive, inspiring, and uplifting content into our culture. The reality is we could use your help, and so there are two ways for that to happen. You could join us on a monthly basis as a Big Impact Insider with a gift of, well, whatever amount you choose. Or you could make a one-time gift. Maybe this episode has really touched your heart and you want to say thanks and keep up the good work. Whichever your preference, we are ready for you to become a Big Impact Insider. You can find all the details on our website at bigimpactradio.com or in the notes to the podcast if you're listening to us in podcast form. Whatever amount, whatever choice you make, we are grateful for it. And we hope you'll help us continue bringing positive content into a culture that sorely needs it. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to The Big Impact, where we share interesting, uplifting, and encouraging stories, hosted by Bill Hobson.
We continue with Cammy Franzese, and her book is called This Thing of Ours, How Faith Saved My Mafia Marriage. And Cammie, before the break, we were kind of discussing about the learning curve for a young lady in love and trying to figure out exactly what this guy she's in love with is made of and his background and his history and what's the family like. And at some point, you got clarification that all this talk about the word and the concept of mafia wasn't necessarily directed at his father, but it was actually involving the man of your dreams. When did that light bulb snap on for you?
Well, like I said, it was already a couple of years into our marriage before I really knew what that life was, what mafia meant, what this thing of ours meant. And even if I had heard that Michael was in it, I didn't know what it was. I didn't read anything about him. I didn't watch any TV. If ever I saw anything about him on TV, I would turn it off. Like I said, I wouldn't read any newspaper. And, when you live out in California, we lived in West LA, you don't see a lot of that there. Had I lived in New York, it might have been a different story. But, out here, I didn't. But when I finally did, like I said, I knew that he had a colorful past. I knew that there was things that went on in his life, but never in my imagination did I have any idea what that was until I was with him, and he was speaking at a church here in Southern California. And I usually have my own book with me that I read. I was at his product table, and I didn't have anything. So he has this little book called The Good, the Bad, and the Forgiven. So I just said, how bad can it be? It's just a little thing. It's a little tiny book. And I read the whole book, and I just was like, I was just floored. I was sad. I was angry. I felt like he was, kind of deceiving. He deceived me. He wasn't honest with me. It was overwhelming. I have to, to put it mildly, I was overwhelmed. I think I just cried out to God and said, wow, God, I didn't even know this and why and how. But at the same time, it just kind of hit me too, in my prayer that I was saying to myself is, God immediately showed me like, okay, but look at the other side, the wow side, how I have changed this man's life. Look where he is now. Look what he's doing now. So that was kind of helpful. But
so you discovered all this after you were married?
Yes. Like I said, before I was married, I knew about, his life with his father. I heard the word mentioned, Mafia, and he had, a group of business associates, but that's what I thought that was. Yeah. I didn't know, what did Mafia mean? What did it mean? What did it entail? Was it just a group of guys who called themselves that? So yes, very naive. And even, I think about it now, if that were one of my daughters, I would just be like, what, were you insane? But
well, it leads to the question of whether or not you were tempted to say, so long, big fella, I don't want any part of this. So what kept you together?
Well, look, we were already married. I had a baby, Mikkel, my oldest daughter, and from the minute that I met this man, he was a good man. He was good to me. He was good to my family. He was kind. He was honorable. I saw all these good things about him. I just said to myself, this couldn't possibly be the same person that they are talking about in this book. yes, I know he was no angel. Yes, I know that he'd been in jail and he'd gotten in trouble. But my father had also been in jail several times. So I just kind of said, okay, well, my dad went to jail and he didn't really do anything that bad. I mean, he came home all the time. He wasn't there for a long time. So I kind of related the two. And I think naively, I just kind of said, whatever is out there that's dark, I don't want to know about, because it's going to ruin what I have and it's going to ruin what I feel about this man, and I don't want to do that. So naively, I just said, I'm not going to listen, read, talk to anybody about it. It's nonsense. Until the day that I read that book and I read what parts of Michael's life in there. I mean, there was one particular chapter in there where it talks about Michael walking down into a room and how scared he was for his life. And I'm saying to myself, wow, why was he so scared for his life? And then he talks about that he was fearful that there would be somebody on the other side of the door once he got into that small room that could possibly take his life. And then it just hit me, and I just said, how does he know that? How does he know that there could possibly be somebody on the other side of the door? And then it just said, I just said, wow, was he at some point in his life, was he the person that was on the other side of the door at some point? And it was a lot. I mean, Michael was traveling that night. When he came out, he knew something was wrong with me. And he was like, are you okay? What happened? Everything's okay? Your family? And I'm like, yeah, I just don't feel well. So I couldn't even talk to him about it because I really was just, too overwhelmed. And I wrote him an email. Went home. He traveled that night. He was off to somewhere else to speak. And I wrote him a really long email expressing my disappointment, my fears, like how could you not? I said, this is a huge thing here. I mean, you married me without even at least saying to me, this is my life. This is what it used to be. I'm going to change it. Although he did say, I'm going to change my life for you when we move out to California. I never imagined what he was changing his life from, the extent and the darkness of what that life was.
At what point, as the picture is coloring in for you, as more of the rough edges are making sense now, and you're thinking, I guess that's why this happened years ago, and I guess that's why he's very cautious about where he goes and the people with whom he associates, and all. As all of the detail is starting to fill in, what is your fear level like, both as a wife and a mom?
My fear mainly was for Michael. I mean, I didn't have any fear for myself or my children that like we were in danger. I never felt like I was in danger, but my fear was for him, and that, how am I going to navigate this from here on, knowing this about his life? How am I going to live not worrying about him? How am I going to raise my children being fearful that, their father was once this man, or is he ever going to be able to leave that, or are they going to come looking for him, or are we going to have to, but then at the same thing, so at that point, like you said, so many things finally made sense to me. I was like, aha, that's why this happened. That's why this happened. That's why we had moved to a new home that I absolutely loved, and we lived there for maybe 2 years. And then one day he decides, I don't want to live here anymore. I don't like this house. I found a better house. Let's move. And I'm like, I don't want to move. I love this house. The school's down the street. But I realized it was not by choice that we had to move. But I didn't know that then. He told me years later it just became unsafe for him to be there because, he gotten word that somebody knew that that's where we lived, and he didn't feel safe being there. And then he said for me, obviously, Camille, my worry was not ever for you and the kids, but I would have never done that to you. I knew that it was just about me. But then I said, but how selfish of you to at least not give me the opportunity to just tell me what's going on and let me decide from there what I wanted to do. You didn't even give me that.
I asked him on this program a few weeks ago if there were still times when he found himself looking over his shoulder, and he said, well, sort of. He knows where to go, where not to go, and when to have the spider senses, tingling, so that there's not a surprise that might crop up out of nowhere. Do you have nervousness to this day?
I do, actually. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when he travels, I do. I have 3 daughters, but my youngest daughter is 21, and she still lives at home, and her and I are very close, and we used to travel with Michael a lot, and the both of us used to have, a lot of anxiety over it. I mean, it's gotten better. Obviously, we have to have faith and trust that God had a different plan for Michael, and that's why he is where he is today. But, sometimes, just the human side of me, and I just comes in, and I do. I mean, especially when he goes back to New York or New Jersey, I'm a little on edge while he's there. Like, I make him check in with me all the time. When he travels, we have certain things that, you must do this, you must do that, because he works so hard and he's so exhausted. He'll get into his room, he'll sit on his bed to take his shoes off, lay his head down, and I've seen it happen hundreds of times, and then he just passes out and goes to sleep. And meanwhile, I'm texting him, I'm calling him, he's not answering. I mean, we had just recently, a scare that I have to admit that did come into my mind, and I got really nervous because, some stuff was going on with his father before his father passed away, and his brother. There was some Newsday article, and it brought light to Michael and his family again. So, I had that fear then. But yeah, I mean, how can I not? As much as I trust God and I have faith, I know we still live in the world where there's evil and, people are crazy.
I remember as part of the story that Michael shared with us, him talking about his time in prison and in solitary confinement, and what a key moment that played in him discovering his faith in Christ. And at the same time, if I remember the timeline correctly, and please set me straight if I'm off on this, but I believe you waited for him through that time. Did you not?
I did, yes. Absolutely.
How hard was that while he was incarcerated and you're left all alone outside?
I mean, it was very difficult. Michael was away for almost 4 years the first time. I had already had, at that time, we had 2 kids. It was very difficult. I didn't know if he was ever going to come home, but I think for myself, my faith in God and my believing that God was not finished with us as a couple, with Michael by himself, that God still had a lot of work for Michael to do. I had a very strong mom and grandmother who were prayer warriors, who prayed for me constantly, who kept me accountable, who would allow me to be sad and, wallow in my sadness. But then they would pull me up, by my bootstraps and say, okay, but listen, God is in control here, and God is taking this time to make Michael a better man. He is using him. He needed him by himself. He needed to take him away off the street to do what he wanted to do with him. My mom was so convinced back then that God was going to be using Michael the way that God is using Michael today, 20 years later, which is amazing how she saw this so long ago, that they just got me through it. They got me through it. They prayed me through it. The women at my church, obviously my own faith, reading my word daily. But, in saying all that, yes, there were many days when I would wake up and look at myself in the mirror and say, oh, what are you doing? What did you do here? How are you going to do this? How are you going to raise these kids alone? How, why? And then I would just, somehow God just always would just show up for me. He would just show up for me, and just in so many different ways, through my children, through my church, through my mother. And I would see his face, his handprint on my life, and I knew that I could get through it, and that I would get through it with the help of everyone.
This edition of The Big Impact with Bill Hobson will continue after this brief break.
At the encouragement of some of our listeners, I'm going to spend less time asking for your support and more time praying that it will come in as we continue injecting positive, inspiring, and uplifting content into our culture. The reality is we could use your help, and so there are 2 ways for that to happen. You could join us on a monthly basis as a Big Impact Insider with a gift of, whatever amount you choose, or you can make a one-time gift. Maybe this episode has really touched your heart and you want to say thanks and keep up the good work. Whichever your preference, we are ready for you to become a Big Impact Insider. You can find all the details on our website at bigimpactradio.com or in the notes to the podcast if you're listening to us in podcast form. Whatever amount, whatever choice you make, we are grateful for it, and we hope you'll help us continue bringing positive content into a culture that sorely needs it. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to The Big Impact, where we share interesting, uplifting, and encouraging stories. Hosted by Bill Hobson.
Our guest is Cammy Franzese, and her husband Michael was a guest on this program a few weeks ago. A powerful story of coming to faith after a lifetime in the Mafia. And Cammy, I would have to think that in the aftermath of your book, This Thing of Ours, How Faith Saved My Mafia Marriage, and when you do some speaking and when Michael's out and about, I would have to think that there have been a bunch of times where someone from the audience, some lady would come up to you and say, my husband and I have been through some tough times and we're wondering if we can make it work. And hearing your testimony reminds me that we can get through pretty much anything if you made it through all of this. Do you hear that a lot?
Yes, I do hear that a lot. And I think that's the reason why I wrote the book, because I did not want to write it because I didn't want to relive it. I didn't want to sit and talk about it. I felt like I had moved on. I was just trying somehow to just have a normal life and get back to some normalcy in my life. And I didn't want to write the book. But when I started traveling these churches with Michael, and I seen that women needed encouragement, young women, older women, married women, single women, and I had a heart for the women who were in the dating years or had a fiance, and they would share their stories with me about, what should I do? So, yes, writing the book, that was my main purpose, was to encourage women. So when I do travel and women say, your book has encouraged me, you have encouraged me, because of you, my husband and I are still married, because we figured if you could get through that, we could get through what we're dealing with. And that is very encouraging to me. And that is why, I continue to do what I do. What
would you do in the year 2020 if one of your daughters came home and said, no, Mom, but he's a really nice guy. He just happens to be in the street gang?
Oh, what would I do? Forget about me.
What would Michael do?
I mean,
now that you put it that way, I hadn't really thought about that angle. I should have, being a father. Has that sort of an awkward conversation happened yet? I would think that the nervous young man standing on the front porch waiting for the door to open to come pick up your daughter for the date, when Michael opens the door, would think to himself, I maybe should have stayed home and played some video games.
Yes, there have been many nervous young men at the door since I do have three daughters. So we have not had one of them come home with any guys from gangs. I think they figured their father was in the biggest gang in the world, that he was already the one gangster in the family was more than enough.
Right.
And they have not. But, he was, for my two older ones, very strict with them when they were dating. And then my youngest daughter, she just has a new boyfriend that's been about 9 months, and we like him. But he's a very strong Christian. He comes from a very strong Christian family. So we are very happy about that for her, because, I said, why make it more difficult? Why date somebody who doesn't believe what you believe, even though he's so nice and he's so this? So yeah. I'm thankful that she's held on to that.
Cammie, you and I, of course, have only known each other for about 30 minutes of conversation here, and I had the same experience with your husband, but I try to pay attention to what I hear between the words or beneath the obvious. And one is, I mentioned earlier, I think you've got a pretty strong backbone, a little feisty side to you, and he, of course, came from a world where nobody questioned him. I mean, that was part of the deal. You don't get to be that high up in a crime family unless people are ready to take instruction without question. How has that personality difference borne itself out in a marriage? I would have to think, at least on a couple of occasions, there were some loud voices in the kitchen when you two had different sides of an argument.
Absolutely, there have been many of those conversations. Because yes, but I think that's what he liked about me, because I did stand my ground. I wasn't impressed by him and the way, other women were.
Well, you mailed both letters.
I did mail both letters. Oh, that's so funny. And when I think about it, it must have really hurt his feelings because he probably thought I wasn't going to do it, but I did. Yeah, I mean, look, I am very strong. I'm a strong woman. I'm Latin. It's in my blood. My mom was a strong woman, but I think he needed that. I mean, in the beginning, I was naive and I was innocent and I believed everything. But then there came to a point where I said, okay, this is where things change and this is what, is going to change. Second time he went away was very, very difficult because he was only home 13 months. And in all honesty, I was not quite sure if I would get through another almost 4 years of what I just came out of. And only by the grace of God are we still here, only by the grace of God. And it doesn't matter how much two people love each other. When you're going through so much turmoil and difficulty and you're just raising a family and you're still young and wondering what's happening in your life, I don't know. I just don't know. I look back now and I see God's hand in it the whole way through, just, carrying me and walking with me through it the whole time. Because if it wasn't for him, I would not be here today.
Did you take the girls with you to visit him in prison?
Yes, I took my girls to see him. And then, by the third time we had a son. So I took my children to see him every single weekend. We were, wherever he was, flying around the country, visiting him. And then when he finally got to Terminal Island, we saw him during the week and the weekend. The phone calls, that was, he's going to call at 3:00. I'm running around with the kids. I got to rush home like crazy to get to the phone. And then sometimes when I wouldn't get there, he'd be so upset. And I'd say, I'm sorry, but I did not put you where you are. I still have a life to lead. I still have children who are involved in school. I still have to go to the grocery store. There's still doctor's appointments. I cannot run my life on your phone schedule, So he didn't like that, but he finally said, okay, you know what? You're right. It's not fair to you. I have to back off. But I think he just, watching his parents navigate, watching his mom navigate, his dad being away for so many years and seeing how they just drifted apart where he didn't, he goes, there was years that went by that my father didn't see all of my siblings. And he was so fearful of that happening that he was just over the top, with calling me 27 times and writing me 99. I have so many letters from him. It's crazy. I think I got like 2 letters a day.
And all these years later, how are the kids in remembering those visits and just how are they in general with the relationship with Dad?
My kids they're very well balanced and they adjusted to it and they were kids, we talk about it all the time, and the crazy thing is they remember the good times. They remember the indoor pool. They remember when Walmart first opened and we went to Walmart. They used to love to go to Walmart, and I would give them each, a certain amount of money, and they would be able to buy what they wanted. And they loved visiting their dad, at certain times. They also remember crying their little eyes out when they had to leave every time because, they had to leave their dad and they missed him. So they have good memories and they have bad memories, but most of them are good. And with my kids, I was always honest with them. Obviously I didn't tell them what their father did, but I said, Daddy did something wrong. He committed a crime. He had to apologize for it. He had to go to court, and now he has to do his time. These are consequences to the choices that he made in life. I said, and so we have to go through this with him because, we're his family. So I was always honest with him about what was going on. The relationship with my son, I think, probably was the most difficult because he was out of Mike's life for those years. Yeah. And, me and my 3 kids were super, super close. He's close with his girls, but, you can see that there was, something that was missing there from him being out of their life for those formative years. Now, my youngest daughter, Julia, she's the only one who's had her father her whole life. So because, when he came home the second time, we had her and he never went to jail again. So, and you can see it in their relationship. It's a completely different relationship. And sometimes it makes me sad for them that they didn't have that same opportunity and that they've worked on it and they continue to build the relationship, but it's not like Julia and Mike. It's nothing like their relationship.
Well, I can't thank you enough for bearing your heart and sharing your side of the story with all of us, not just in this interview, but in the book, This Thing of Ours, How Faith saved my Mafia marriage. For those of you listening to us in podcast form, I'll put a link to the book in the podcast notes. For everybody else, you certainly can go on Amazon and grab it. And, Cammie, I'm sure you're well aware of this, but the more that you share the story of perseverance and relationship dedication, the more it encourages people who are maybe hanging on by a couple of fingernails and wondering if it's all worthwhile. And if nothing else, if the book doesn't sell 1 million copies, but there are a handful of marriages that are saved because of it, I think that's a pretty worthwhile endeavor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like I said, I don't care how many books I sell. I just want to change people's lives and help them save their marriage and to hold on and make the choice to say, yes, I'm going to say yes to this marriage and I'm going to fight for it.
Well, I can't thank you enough. Take care. And when your next book comes out, make sure you give us a call.
Okay. Thank you.
Did you know that every episode of the Big Impact Podcast is available for you to enjoy for free online at bigimpactpodcast.com? You'll hear from Hall of Fame athletes, Grammy Award-winning musicians, heroes, inspirational figures, and some people you've never heard of before, but whose stories you'll never forget. Check out the archives of the Big Impact Podcast online for free at bigimpactpodcast.com. Thanks for listening to this inspiring, interesting, encouraging, and uplifting episode of The Big Impact. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you enjoy podcasts. And we would love to have your support as a Big Impact Insider to help these stories continue. You'll find that information as well as every episode we've ever done online at bigimpactradio.com.